Under the low fluorescent light of the Capitol subcommittee chamber, the air feels suspended. Neither night nor morning, just a liminal hour between silence and consequence. Papers lie scattered, microphones dead, chairs angled as if ghosts had just vacated them. In one of those chairs sits a young staffer, 28, exhausted, trembling. The cameras outside still hum, waiting for a statement that will never come. What remains inside is an empty stage for a truth too heavy to say aloud. The clock reads 2:47 a.m. The hearing that was meant to cleanse the record has collapsed into something darker, a ritual of concealment. The aide's reflection flickers in the polished table, eyes wide, breath unsteady, realizing they are the only person left to remember what actually happened behind those closed doors. Outside, a voice calls their name. They don't answer. From the hallway, a single sentence breaks the paralysis. "You understand what we've done." It is neither threat nor confession, but something in between. The tone of someone who knows the line between right and ruin has already been crossed. The staffer recognizes the voice, a senior counsel, unseen but unmistakable, and with it, the weight of shared guilt. What they've done isn't a crime of greed, not exactly. It's obedience turned to silence. The words hang in the stale air, like an oath recited backwards. The aide looks down at the recorder in their pocket, thumb trembling over the stop button, knowing the tape captures not evidence, but complicity. When the cameras return in the morning, the headline will read, "Ethics Panel Reviews Internal Procedures." Nothing more. The public will see order restored, microphones reconnected, members speaking solemnly about transparency. But those inside know the real function of the hearing was never revelation. It was containment. The ritual must look clean, procedural, democratic. Behind each statement about integrity lies a careful choreography. Who sits? Who speaks? What is struck from the record? The staffer, once idealistic, now understands that oversight is a kind of theater, not to expose wrongdoing, but to domesticate it, to manage outrage into something the system can survive. While citizens watch daytime debates, firebrands shouting across the aisle, fingers jabbing, sound bites crafted for evening news, another war rages quietly beneath the floorboards. In offices without windows, influence trades hands in coded language and late-night calls. Access lists, committee invites, and corporate briefings form the real battleground. Lobbyists move like shadows, carrying favors disguised as data. The partisan war is public, but beneath it, a subtler campaign unites both sides. The preservation of access, the economy of proximity. The staffer sees it now, a labyrinth built not of laws, but of relationships, where loyalty is a form of currency and the truth is negotiable. Months earlier, before the night of the hearing, the same aide had drafted a confidential memo, the kind never logged in archives or released under freedom of information. It wasn't about legislation or ethics, but something more mundane and revealing. Who should be in the room? The memo listed names, firms, and donors, marked not by merit, but by influence. At the time, it felt procedural. Now, in the hollow quiet, the aide realizes it was an instruction manual for gatekeeping. They remember typing the words, "priority access," unaware that every keystroke bound them tighter to the machinery of control they thought they were only observing. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. They echo through the marble corridor, closing in. The aide's pulse matches the rhythm. 1, 2, pause, then another. The door handle shifts, stops. Whoever stands outside isn't there to protect the record. They're there to reclaim it. The staffer grips the memo tighter, the edges damp with sweat. Somewhere beyond the heavy oak door, A security light flickers. The silence is suffocating. In this moment, truth feels less like revelation and more like exposure. Dangerous, irreversible. The knock comes again. Louder this time. They glance at the clock. 2:47 a.m. The hearing is over. The war, they now understand, is only beginning. To understand this war, we must go back. This hearing, the trembling aide, the hidden voice, the redacted files, is not an anomaly, but a symptom. The machinery that powers it was built long before any of them arrived. The story doesn't begin with this Congress, or even this century. It begins in the founding contradictions of a republic that feared tyranny, but built systems of influence to guard itself. The narrator's tone shifts from immediacy to excavation. The chamber fades into the background. The investigation now turns backward into history's darker corridors, where the roots of power first learned how to hide. It began, as all paradoxes do, with idealism. In 1787, James Madison stood before the newborn republic and warned of the danger he feared most, the tyranny of factions. To him, freedom was a fragile balance. Too much unity invited despotism. Too much division invited decay. What he could not foresee was how those factions, the very ones he sought to restrain, would one day define the American system itself. They would not destroy democracy. They would sustain it, even feed it. Every interest would find a voice. Every voice would demand a representative. And soon the republic would mistake influence for participation. The architecture of freedom carried within it the seed of manipulation. In the decades that followed, the corridors of Congress were not yet corridors of power, but of hope. Veterans, farmers, inventors, and widows approached with handwritten petitions, ink-stained and trembling with conviction. They came not as customers, but as citizens, believing that government existed to listen. In those early years, access was not a privilege sold to the highest bidder. It was a right exercised by those who built the nation itself. Petitioning was the heartbeat of democracy, an act of faith between the governed and the governors. But even faith in the right hands could become a tool. That tool took its first shape in 1792. When Revolutionary War veterans grew weary of waiting for back pay, they hired William Hull, a respected soldier, to plead their cause before Congress. Hull was not a schemer or a profiteer. He was a man trying to translate need into language lawmakers could hear. But in that moment, something irreversible happened. A middleman entered the sacred space between citizen and state. The transaction was modest, moral, and yet fateful. The Republic had created its first paid intermediary, the first lobbyist. What began as representation soon revealed itself as leverage. By the mid-19th century, leverage had learned the art of charm. The age of persuasion had gilded its edges. Industrialists like Samuel Colt no longer arrived with petitions, but with gifts. Lavish dinners, engraved revolvers, and carefully placed promises. Access was purchased in parlors rather than pleaded in halls. Sam Ward, the so-called king of the lobby, perfected the dance, blending wit, wine, and corruption until bribery felt like diplomacy. Politics became a marketplace, and persuasion a performance. The moral appeal of the early republic faded into an age where every cause, noble or not, could find its price. By the 1870s, the republic could see its own reflection and recoil from it. Political cartoons in Harper's Weekly depicted a monstrous creature slithering through the Capitol. The lobby serpent. Its coils wound around desks and statutes, its scales engraved with the names of financiers and speculators. The public laughed, but uneasily. They knew the monster was not fiction. It was an embodiment of the bargain everyone tolerated. Outrage on Sunday, acceptance on Monday. The serpent fed not on scandal, but on silence. In 1946, after a century of moral fatigue, Congress promised reform. The Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act was hailed as a turning point. Sunlight, at last, upon the hidden corridors. Yet within a decade, the light dimmed. In United States v. Harris, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that only direct communication with lawmakers counted as lobbying. Meetings with aides, drafting assistants, and off-record influence fell conveniently outside the law. Oversight was blinded where it mattered most, in the shadows. Legality became the mask that secrecy wore comfortably. The serpent, once cornered, had simply learned to live underground. Then came the age of abundance, and with it, expansion. After World War II, Washington transformed from a civic capital into a vast organism of industry and bureaucracy. The New Deal's legacy created entire ecosystems of agencies, each a potential gateway for influence. Unions, corporations, trade groups, and advocacy organizations flourished, hiring armies of professionals whose sole task was access. Lobbying ceased to be a scandal. It became an institution. Influence was no longer whispered. It was managed, budgeted, and standardized. What had once been improvised manipulation was now a permanent feature of governance. The empire of access had arrived. By the middle of the 20th century, that empire found new rulers. Political parties, long content to criticize the influence industry, realized they could command it. Democrats courted unions and reform coalitions. Republicans built bridges with corporate and defense interests. Lobbyists no longer stood outside the system. They were absorbed into it. Influence became a political weapon, and ideology its currency. The lines between persuasion, power, and partisanship blurred until they were indistinguishable. The system had adapted once again, and this time, it would never let go. In the years after World War II, America rebuilt not just its cities and industries, but its corridors of power. The capital filled with new committees meant to guide a modern state. Agriculture, defense, appropriations, commerce. Yet over time, something shifted. The real function of these committees moved quietly from policymaking to influence management. They became the gatekeepers of access, arbiters of whose voices mattered. Party operatives learned that controlling a hearing schedule or a witness list was as valuable as passing a bill. Access, not ideology, became currency. It was never declared, never debated. But somewhere in the late 1940s, Congress discovered that its committees could do more than shape law. They could shape loyalty. Behind those closed committee doors emerged a new class of professionals. They called themselves liaisons, not lobbyists, former aides, lawyers, and fundraisers, who understood the nuances of timing, tone, and trust. Their skill wasn't persuasion, it was proximity. They bridged the invisible gap between donors and decision-makers, promising introductions that felt more valuable than legislation itself. These brokers rarely appeared in photographs or public records, yet their fingerprints stained every bill. They operated behind the curtain, translating money into influence with the precision of diplomats and the secrecy of spies. Their trade was subtle, their impact immense. By the 1960s, the pattern had hardened into partisanship, but beneath the colors of blue and red, the machinery was the same. Democrats wove influence through labor unions, civil rights movements, and community organizations that seemed grassroots but funneled access upward. Republicans built their own empire through business coalitions, oil magnates, and defense contractors. Each side crafted a moral justification for its networks, the people versus the market, yet both operated within the same shadow infrastructure. Ideological language masked an identical pursuit: to own the routes through which decisions flowed. What differed was only the accent of power. By the 1970s, every lobbyist knew the rule. Access required allegiance. Loyalty to a party became the toll for entry into the legislative bloodstream. Those who hesitated, who tried to remain neutral or transactional, found their calls unanswered, their contracts lost. Those who pledged themselves to the right committee chairs were rewarded with closed-door briefings and early drafts of legislation. The game no longer rewarded truth or merit, only alignment. It wasn't about convincing anyone, it was about belonging. And in that belonging, democracy itself began to narrow. Each election cycle became a season of betrayal. Lobbyists who had sworn loyalty to one side quietly shifted their allegiance as power changed hands. The morning after a loss, phones rang with new promises, fresh alliances forged from expedience, not conviction. In Washington, survival meant fluid identity. Betrayal wasn't scandal, it was strategy. Clients demanded results, not loyalty, and lobbyists adapted, trading old contacts for new invitations. Party lines blurred beneath the hum of self-preservation. Each cycle left behind another layer of cynicism, and another reason to never trust what anyone in that town swore was principle. Eventually, the chaos congealed into order, an order as efficient as it was corrupt. Party leaders formalized what had long been implicit. Insider firms would receive priority access, while outsiders would be locked out. The unwritten deal became institutionalized. Those within the inner ring would shape draft language, control donations, and determine whose policy ideas lived or died. The two-tier system was complete. Influence for the few, performance for the many. What had once been backroom dealing was now procedural routine. Quiet power no longer needed to hide. It simply called itself governance. From the Capitol to the banks of the Potomac, influence followed gravity, settling along a single stretch of asphalt in downtown Washington. It was here, amid marble facades and discreet signage, that a new empire would rise. The addresses changed, the faces rotated, but the principle endured. Control access, and you control the republic. The narrator's tone turns ominous. The next battlefield was not ideological, but geographical, a street that would come to symbolize the fusion of money, politics, and permanence. Its name would echo through scandal after scandal, whispered as both place and prophecy. K Street. It began as a street like any other, a corridor of polished stone and muted ambition running through the heart of Washington, D.C. But inside those marble offices, decisions were made that shaped the nation's pulse, and few outside knew their names. To walk down K Street in the 1990s was to feel the hum of invisible power. Discreet meetings behind frosted glass, checkbooks opening like confessions, influence traded in whispers softer than prayer. Before it became a metaphor for corruption, it was a physical place, precise and claustrophobic, where access was worth more than conviction. In that silence, a war was forming, not over ideology, but over who would own the levers of democracy itself. In 1995, two men drew the blueprint for that war. Grover Norquist, the ideological tactician, and Tom DeLay, the enforcer, sat at the center of a movement that saw power not as a pendulum between parties, but as an empire to be seized and held. Their idea was radical in its simplicity. If influence could not be eradicated, it could be captured. They called it the K Street Project, a quiet campaign to turn the city's lobbying firms into an extension of the Republican Party. Every client, every donor, every favor would be mapped, monitored, and disciplined. The battlefield wasn't the Capitol floor, it was the boardroom. Control influence, and you control the future. From there, the surveillance began. Operatives and aides were assigned to build what became known internally as the list. a living dossier of allegiance. Names, donations, hiring records, even social affiliations were logged. Which firms hired Democrats? Which executives hedged their bets? In a town where memory was currency, this list became the ultimate weapon. It wasn't about ideology. It was about obedience. Lobbyists learned that data could define destiny. Who you hired determined who you could reach. Who you reached decided what your clients gained. On the surface, it looked like democracy at work. Beneath, it was something closer to fealty, quantified, organized, and quietly enforced. Then came the ultimatum, spoken softly, enforced ruthlessly. Party leadership summoned top lobbying executives to private meetings and delivered a message cloaked in courtesy. Hire Democrats, lose access. Firms that resisted found their calls unanswered, their invitations rescinded, their clients isolated. Access, once earned through expertise or trust, was now a privilege of submission. The irony was profound. The party that preached free markets had created a monopoly on influence. Behind polished smiles and patriotic slogans, the city's moral architecture inverted. Lobbyists who once sold persuasion now sold loyalty, and the cost was silence. But Washington has no monopolies, only mirrors. Within months, Democratic strategists began assembling their own shadow system. Progressive think tanks, advocacy groups, and party-aligned law firms designed to funnel influence through moral camouflage. They called it balance, even fairness. But the logic was identical. Create a partisan ecosystem where donations, access, and narrative control were self-contained. Idealism became a product line. The same revolving door spun faster, just in the opposite direction. One side justified consolidation as reform, the other called it resistance. In truth, both were building the same machine, powered by belief, insulated by righteousness, and lubricated by money. The facade cracked during one of Washington's most consequential policy fights, energy deregulation. The debate was fierce in public. Capitalism versus oversight, innovation versus restraint. Yet behind closed doors, the same lobbyists drafted the fine print for both sides. Fossil fuel executives funded Republicans to loosen controls, while Democratic intermediaries carved out tax breaks under the banner of transition. The bills were edited, swapped, and rebranded, until the difference between victory and defeat became a matter of who claimed credit. The illusion of opposition sustained the spectacle. Deregulation wasn't a policy, it was a compromise disguised as competition. By the early 2000s, fragments of the truth began to leak. Journalists uncovered internal memos, donor charts, and strategy documents tying corporate contracts directly to political appointments. But each revelation drowned beneath partisan spin. Conservatives called it accountability. Liberals called it hypocrisy. The public called it confusing. What might have been exposure became a managed narrative, one more performance of outrage that preserved the equilibrium of influence. The K Street Project survived not by denial, but by diffusion. When everyone shares the blame, no one pays the cost. Still, tension was building. The lists grew longer. The money moved faster. And in the midst of it all, one name began to surface. A man whose reach touched every corner of the shadow empire. His clients were tribal governments, corporations, and congressmen alike. His methods blurred the line between persuasion and extortion. His fall would expose what the system refused to see about itself. That man was Jack Abramoff. And when his story broke, the lobby wars would no longer be political. They would become criminal. He entered Washington like a character from a different script, charismatic, articulate, and unshakably certain that influence was a form of genius. Jack Abramoff emerged from the Republican Revolution of the 1990s not as a legislator or bureaucrat, but as an architect of persuasion. A true believer turned opportunist, he saw politics not as service, but as theater, and himself its most effective director. His gift was intimacy. He made power personal. A phone call, a lunch, a promise whispered just beyond the rules. What began as idealism, the belief that policy could be guided by conviction, became empire building by charm. By the decade's end, few in Washington could resist the myth of the man who could open any door. His ascent found its perfect market: America's newly rich Native American tribes. After the legalization of tribal gaming in the 1980s and 1990s, casino profits transformed small communities into political forces overnight. They needed allies in Congress to defend their interests, and Abramoff arrived with both confidence and an invoice. Millions flowed into his firm to protect gaming rights and block rival tribes from encroaching markets. But protection was a promise that rarely materialized. Lobbying became ritual, money in exchange for reassurance, a system that rewarded anxiety more than results. He cloaked exploitation in representation, turning centuries of dispossession into one more business opportunity in the marketplace of democracy. To sustain his illusion, Abramoff constructed an invisible web of entities: front companies, fake charities, and think tanks that existed mostly on paper. Through them, money moved in loops too complex for auditors to follow. Nonprofits preached reform while funneling cash into private accounts. Consulting firms billed clients for projects that never existed. It was a design built not to hide theft, but to normalize it. When investigators later tried to trace the flow, they found only reflections: money leading to money, influence feeding itself. The architecture of deception was bureaucratic perfection, lawful in appearance, criminal in intent. In Washington, even fraud could look professional. Though hailed as a Republican kingmaker, Abramoff's reach crossed every aisle. Behind closed doors, he courted Democrats who chaired crucial committees, offering campaign contributions disguised as goodwill. It was the final proof that ideology had become irrelevant. Influence was the only true bipartisan value. To the world outside, Washington remained polarized. Inside, it functioned as a single organism sustained by access and transaction. Party lines existed for the public. Cooperation existed for profit. The revelation wasn't that Abramoff corrupted the system. It was that the system welcomed him. The corruption rarely looked like crime. It looked like hospitality. Lavish golf trips to Scotland, box seats at sports arenas, consulting jobs offered to the spouses of congressmen, each gesture small enough to be deniable, yet large enough to cultivate dependence. The lines between gift and bribe, courtesy and control, blurred until they disappeared entirely. Lobbyists and lawmakers spoke of friendship while exchanging invoices. By then, Abramoff had become less a man than a method, the art of the bribe disguised as the culture of access. As his circle widened, so did the moral collapse. Former congressional aides, once sworn to protect the public interest, now worked for him, using the knowledge of legislative schedules and personal habits of their former bosses to shape new deals. They became translators of corruption, selling what the public thought was loyalty back to those who paid more. Washington's famous revolving door spun faster, its motion justified as career progress. Betrayal had become a resume skill. The unraveling began with something small: a leaked email, a careless line between associates joking about monetizing tribes. But in Washington, words are never private for long. Subpoenas followed. Federal investigators traced donations, receipts, favors exchanged under coded language. The scandal grew until it reached the Capitol itself. Headlines named figures once considered untouchable. The empire Abramov had built on intimacy and deniability began to collapse under its own weight. Silence had finally found a voice, and it spoke in the language of evidence. When the trial opened in 2006, it wasn't just Abramov on display. It was the ecosystem that had nourished him. He pled guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and tax evasion. But even in defeat, he seemed aware that he was merely the symptom. The courtroom became a stage for America's ritual absolution. One man punished, the rest forgiven by omission. Senators promised reform, lobbyists promised restraint. Cameras flashed, statements were made. Yet beneath the surface, nothing fundamental changed. The conviction was not closure, it was choreography. In the aftermath, dozens of staffers resigned, firms rebranded, new ethics rules were passed. Washington congratulated itself for learning a lesson. But within months, the same meetings resumed, only with quieter language and subtler handshakes. The machinery of influence didn't stop. It evolved. The players rotated, the tactics refined, the prices adjusted for inflation. Abramov's empire had fallen, but his methods became the blueprint. The scandal ended. The system endured. By the early 21st century, power no longer wore a badge or carried a title. It wore a logo, a name etched into the marble of Washington's new temples, the think tanks. Born in the mid-20th century as policy research institutions, they had evolved into ideological factories, producing arguments disguised as analysis. Each white paper, each televised expert, was part of a larger choreography, the transformation of private agenda into public doctrine. Their funding came not from the taxpayers they claimed to inform, but from corporations and donors with vested stakes in the conclusions. What had once been academic inquiry became camouflage, the intellect of influence, polished and for sale. Ideas in Washington became weapons, and paper their sharpest blade. A single policy memo, printed on embossed letterhead, could circulate through committee offices and reshape national debate before the public ever heard the question. Reports drafted in downtown glass towers reached congressional aides long before hearings were scheduled. By the time the debate appeared on television, its language had already been chosen. Legislation was no longer written by conviction, but by citation, an endless chain of studies designed to look neutral but anchored in profit. Persuasion no longer required presence, it required paper. But the true revolution came with a change in tax code. The rise of 501(c)(4) organizations, social welfare, non-profits, allowed money to move in silence. Donors vanished behind layers of legal protection. A $1 million contribution became a ghost, untraceable, untaxed, and unaccountable. What began as a mechanism for civic engagement turned into a currency of hidden influence. Campaign ads, lobbying drives, and research grants could now be financed without names attached. The invention of the invisible donor didn't just change who spoke in politics. It changed who was allowed to remain unheard. Anonymity became a weapon of power. Corporations adapted instantly. To hedge risk, they learned to give twice, equal amounts to opposing sides. Millions poured into Republican-aligned advocacy networks, millions more into Democratic nonprofits, promoting progressive reform. The strategy wasn't ideological, it was insurance. No matter who won, the shareholders' interest was protected. Every election became a performance, the illusion of conflict concealing continuity. In a system fueled by polarization, influence discovered the perfect disguise: bipartisanship. The left and the right debated policies written by the same donors, in words drafted by the same consultants, for outcomes that always converged on profit. One bill told the story in miniature. In a Senate committee room, a proposal to lower prescription drug costs quietly collapsed. The official record called it procedural delay. In truth, pharmaceutical money had funded both the reformers and their opponents. Lobbyists wrote amendments that neutralized themselves. Advocacy groups campaigned for change while cashing checks from the very industry they condemned. When the bill died, both parties blamed the other, but the fingerprints on the corpse were bipartisan. Public outrage flared briefly, then faded. Reform in Washington had learned to die politely. Soon, even the identities of those waging influence became untraceable. Shell nonprofits appeared overnight, citizens' coalitions without citizens. Public policy initiatives operated from post office boxes. Their websites were filled with stock photos, their leaders recycled from past campaigns. Each existed just long enough to fund an ad, shape a vote, or kill a regulation, before dissolving into the ether. Behind them were consulting firms. Behind those, donors hidden by law. The deception wasn't sloppy. It was engineered. The machinery of democracy had acquired new ghosts, perfectly legal and entirely invisible. Within this new ecosystem, people became interchangeable. Congressional staffers moved seamlessly into think tanks, then into lobbying firms, and back again. The same names reappeared on op-eds, grant announcements, and advisory panels, carrying authority earned through repetition rather than truth. The lines between journalist, scholar, and advocate blurred until they were indistinguishable. The carousel spun faster with every election, powered by ambition and sustained by access. Corruption didn't need conspiracy, it needed routine. And so the narrator's voice falls into unease. If the money can no longer be followed, can accountability still exist? The lobby wars, once waged in corridors and courtrooms, now breathe in data centers and donor networks, invisible yet omnipresent. The battlefield has no front lines, no generals, no witnesses. It is a war without noise, fought in the algorithms of attention and the fine print of tax exemptions. Democracy still votes, but it no longer sees. Influence has learned to live in shadow, and shadow, once alive, never dies easily. In the marble corridors of Capitol Hill, grandeur is a distraction. Cameras capture speeches, applause, and symbolic votes, the visible theater of democracy. But the real decisions happen elsewhere, in rooms without microphones, where the door closes softly and the air grows still. There, committees shape the laws long before the public sees their names. The hierarchy is invisible. The speaker's gavel may command the stage, but the committee chair decides what will never reach it. Power hides in procedure, in the quiet clauses and whispered amendments that never make headlines. The thrones of Congress are not elevated. They are enclosed. Control in Washington is never declared. It is assigned. Party leaders discovered long ago that the most effective way to enforce loyalty wasn't persuasion, it was permission. Committee assignments became the currency of obedience, a promotion for those who complied, exile for those who hesitated. Members learned to align not by ideology, but by access. To question leadership was to risk irrelevance. To obey was to guarantee a future. It was the architecture of obedience, elegant, efficient, and entirely legal. In the House and Senate alike, ambition was molded by fear disguised as discipline. Each committee chair soon became something more than an administrator. They were gatekeepers, custodians of the nation's industries, regulators of its secrets. To reach one was to unlock entire sectors of government. For lobbyists, this was the revelation. Personal relationships mattered more than public outcomes. A lunch, a favor, a donation. These became the syntax of influence, Legislation turned secondary to logistics. Who could reach whom, how often, and under what pretext? In the calculus of Washington, proximity replaced principle. Access became a form of authorship. To influence a chair was to rewrite the story of the nation in advance. The market for this access evolved into its own economy. Invitations became currency. Private briefings, a sign of status. The most valuable commodity was not information but time, the minutes alone with a decision maker when policy was still fluid. Lobbyists, executives, and consultants competed for those minutes as though bidding for something sacred. Votes, once counted in chambers, were now prearranged in corridors. Each meeting had a price, though never in money directly. Allegiance, loyalty, and silence. These were the currencies exchanged. Washington's new marketplace was invisible, but its profits were measurable in legislation. Nowhere was this system more visible than in defense appropriations. Each budget cycle brought its own quiet choreography, contractors aligning with favored lobbyists, lobbyists aligning with committee aides, aides answering to party leadership. Before billions in contracts were released, firms were encouraged, often wordlessly, to retain trusted intermediaries. These intermediaries, coincidentally, had deep ties to those drafting the bills. What began as oversight became orchestration. In one cycle, a single lobbyist represented 3 defense firms, all competing for the same funding, yet all routed through the same political office. War in Washington had its own supply chain, and influence was its first delivery. Outside the committee room, the excluded waited. Minority party lobbyists, junior aides, and citizen advocates gathered in the hallways, listening for footsteps behind locked doors. Inside, amendments were negotiated, contracts exchanged, and final language sealed before daylight. The process was legal, but not public, constitutional, but not transparent. For those outside, there was only the silence of denial and the understanding that influence was not lost, merely withheld. In Washington, exclusion is a message more powerful than any law. The narrator's voice hardens as the truth emerges. The fight in Washington was never truly about ideology or reform, but about entry. Who could approach? Who could listen? Who could speak? Every rule, every hearing, every handshake traced back to that single threshold, the locked door. Through it, the same few passed again and again, reshaping history from within. For everyone else, democracy existed only through keyholes, glimpses of power, distorted by distance. And in that distortion lies the real illusion that access and representation are the same thing. In Washington, departures are illusions, resignations, retirements, even scandals. None of them close the door. The same faces reappear with new badges, new titles, and higher salaries. A chief of staff becomes a consultant. A cabinet official joins a think tank. A legislator morphs into a policy advisor. The marble steps of Capitol Hill lead not into exile, but into a loop, a perpetual motion machine that rewards familiarity over renewal. Power, once gained, is never surrendered. It merely changes form. The revolving door doesn't spin people out of government. It keeps them orbiting around it. In this cycle, loyalty becomes a career path. Aides who once drafted legislation soon find themselves selling interpretations of it. Strategists who mastered political messaging rebrand as consultants, shaping the narratives of private clients. Experience, once a service to the public, becomes a commodity for sale. Each transition is justified as expertise, yet the effect is cumulative. The same ideas circulate, repackaged, monetized, and resold to those who can afford them. For the faithful, the party ensures soft landings. Influence is their pension. and every corridor in Washington eventually connects to a boardroom. Behind every promise of reform lies a quieter strategy. Party leadership understands that sending loyal operatives into lobbying firms isn't betrayal, it's extension. The same figures who once took orders from the whip now deliver them from the outside, embedded in the machinery of influence. The revolving door, far from accidental, has become the party's bloodstream, a system of ideological continuity disguised as professional opportunity. Reformers call it corruption. Insiders call it efficiency. Either way, it ensures one thing, that no matter who wins the election, the network remains intact. But the door swings both ways. Lobbyists who once whispered from the shadows are appointed to commissions and advisory boards, rewriting the rules they previously exploited. An attorney for an oil consortium becomes a deputy at the Energy Department. A pharmaceutical executive advises on healthcare reform. The line between public duty and private interest collapses into a handshake. In Washington, return is redemption, and redemption is influence reclaimed. The regulators become the regulated, and the circle completes itself. Some learn to adapt more fluidly. When administrations change, allegiances bend. Consultants who once courted Republicans become Democratic donors. Operatives reinvent themselves as centrists, policy experts, or bipartisan strategists. Party databases track them, noting every favor, every donation, every switch. Survival in this ecosystem demands amnesia. Loyalty is transactional, not moral. What matters is endurance. And in a city where access defines worth, betrayal often pays better than faith. Occasionally, conscience intervenes. A former staffer, now years removed from public service, confesses privately that the line between helping and exploiting blurred long ago. The justification was easy. Everyone was doing it, and no one was getting hurt. But over time, a darker realization settled in, that every shortcut taken, every contact leveraged, eroded the very institution they claimed to serve. You tell yourself it's experience, the staffer admits, but eventually, it's experience that owns you. The final image lingers in silence. Empty offices, renamed firms, brass plaques replaced, but never removed. The faces change, the functions remain. The narrator asks the question that hovers over every corridor of power. If everyone trades sides, what does loyalty mean? In a system where service leads to profit and conscience leads to exile, who remains untainted? The answer is never spoken, because in Washington, silence itself is a survival strategy, and the door, even now, never stops turning. It begins like every Washington storm, a headline, a hearing, and a promise of accountability. One afternoon, a House ethics complaint surfaces, implicating a senior committee member in alleged coordination with lobbyists. For 24 hours, the air hums with outrage. Then, almost imperceptibly, the noise fades. The file is referred to subcommittees, language is softened, and witnesses are postponed. Within weeks, the complaint is gone, sealed, redacted, replaced by new headlines. There is no clearance, no confession, only disappearance. In Washington, scandal doesn't die of exposure. It dies of procedure. Inside the committee rooms, fluorescent light falls on faces trained to appear calm. Former staffers recall the moment an inquiry turned inward, when the mission shifted from investigating wrongdoing to protecting the institution. The phrase was spoken softly, but it carried the weight of survival. Protecting the institution meant protecting its image, its hierarchy, its illusion of purity. It meant closing the shutters before daylight touched the glass. Within that justification lies Washington's oldest trick: moral compromise, spoken in the language of duty. Weeks later, a trace, remains. A digital one. A cache of internal emails leaks to a journalist, showing coordination between the accused and senior aides. For a brief moment, truth flickers. Then the servers are upgraded. Backups are archived. Months of correspondence vanish under the pretense of maintenance. The logs show nothing. Not a deletion, not a command. It's as if the scandal rewrote itself out of existence. In an era where data never dies, the most powerful act of censorship is to pretend the evidence never lived. Reporters chasing the story learn the shape of silence. Credentials suspended, phones unanswered, doors politely shut. Editors receive quiet phone calls, reminding them of ongoing partnerships with party offices. Some stories are killed in drafts, others vanish after publication, replaced by lighter headlines. The journalists who persist find themselves labeled as partisan, unstable, or naive. No threats, just pressure, applied with precision until curiosity feels like risk. In Washington, access is the leash, and truth is what gets released only when convenient. In the aftermath, reform takes its ritual form. A bipartisan commission for oversight is proposed, announced with solemn speeches about restoring faith in democracy. Cameras roll, applause follows, and the resolution passes in spirit. Weeks later, it stalls in committee, deemed too divisive to proceed. No one votes against transparency. They simply never vote for it. Oversight remains a headline, not a habit. In Washington's theater of ethics, performance is policy. The documents circulate again, quietly. Copies of copies, names blacked out, memos unsigned. A whistleblower tries one last time, sending the full file to 3 major outlets. None respond. Editors, warned from past fights, see only risk without reward. The public's outrage has moved on. The narrative window is closed. What remains is fatigue, the slow death of truth by repetition. The scandal doesn't explode, it dissolves. Years later, the narrator's voice softens. In a government archive, boxes sit stacked, labeled, redacted, forgotten. The files exist, faint, incomplete, but real. Yet the story they tell has vanished, consumed by its own containment. Democracy remembers only what it allows itself to see. And in those blank spaces where sentences once lived, something colder endures. The ghosts of accountability, waiting for someone to read between the black lines. They are the ones who chose to speak when silence would have been easier. Their names are lost, or perhaps protected, but their actions ripple through corridors that still pretend not to know them. Staffers, lobbyists, aides, people trained to obey, decided at last that obedience had become complicity. They stepped across an invisible line between loyalty and conscience, not because they sought glory, but because something in them refused to rot quietly. Each story begins the same way, with knowledge too heavy to carry and a silence that no longer felt safe. It started with a discovery made by accident. A young congressional aide, overworked and underestimated, scrolling through internal scheduling memos. What they saw wasn't policy, but privilege cataloged in plain text. Lists of approved lobbyists who would always be seen and those who never would. The distinction had nothing to do with expertise, everything to do with money. Which donors funded which campaigns, who was trustworthy, who wasn't. The aides stared at the names for hours, feeling a quiet nausea. It was not corruption hidden in darkness. It was corruption printed in calendar form. The realization didn't radicalize them overnight. It hollowed them slowly. That night, the aides sat alone in their apartment, the glow of the monitor cutting through the dark. The memos lay open on the screen, waiting for a decision. To leak them meant exile. To stay silent meant complicity. Between those two fates, the choice became strangely simple. Near midnight, an encrypted message left their inbox, addressed to an investigative journalist known for chasing lost causes. It was a small act, a few clicks. But in Washington, truth sent at midnight is always an act of war. And every war begins with a defector. By sunrise, the war was over. The AIDS badge no longer worked. Their access was revoked, their email suspended. Colleagues avoided eye contact, as though guilt might be contagious. Within hours, anonymous briefings painted them as unstable, vindictive, disloyal. Officially, there was no firing, just reassignment, pending review. Unofficially, their career was dead. The system did what it always does when threatened. It closed ranks, buried the story, and punished the messenger without ever naming the crime. Revenge wears the mask of procedure. Across town, another story began to unfold. A lobbyist, decades into the game, decided to break it. He was no idealist. He'd built his wealth on proximity, traded access like currency. But somewhere between profit and power, the weight of deceit became unbearable. He gathered internal ledgers, shell company records, donation trails disguised as consulting fees, and delivered them to federal investigators. No press release, no confession, just a quiet surrender of evidence. For the first time, he stopped selling influence and started exposing it. The price came swiftly. Clients evaporated overnight. Partners issued statements of separation for business reasons. Anonymous letters appeared, hinting that safety was not guaranteed. On paper, the whistleblower was under federal protection. In reality, they were radioactive. No law can shield someone from being forgotten, from whispered warnings that they're not to be trusted. In a city addicted to access, truth-tellers become contaminants. They survive, but not as themselves. Those who spoke carry the aftermath in silence. Insomnia becomes ritual, paranoia, a form of discipline. They replay every decision, every moment they could have stayed quiet. And the cruelest truth follows them, that their courage did not change the system. The machinery swallowed the evidence, rewrote the narrative, and continued on. Integrity became its own punishment. Still, their echoes linger, in rumors, in archived files, in the few reporters who refuse to forget. The narrator's voice lowers, almost a whisper. They tried to cleanse the system and became its casualties. They thought exposure would end the rot. Instead, it only revealed its depth. What they uncovered wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning still waiting to arrive. It ends where it began, in the halls of power that never truly change. After decades of hearings, scandals, and reforms, one truth remains immutable. The real winner of the lobby wars was never a party, nor a movement, nor even a man. It was the institution itself. Congress endured every outrage, every investigation, every promise of transparency, and emerged stronger, not by virtue, but by adaptation. Like an organism designed for survival, it learned to feed on conflict, to draw strength from scandal, to disguise preservation as reform. In the Great War for Influence, the House didn't defend democracy. It defended itself. For every headline that shouted accountability, a rule was quietly rewritten. Disclosure laws demanded transparency, yet left untouched the channels that mattered most. Ethics panels held hearings, but only on cases they could afford to lose. Oversight committees claimed independence, yet operated within the same architecture of loyalty and hierarchy. Every reform reinforced the House's supremacy, binding power to its own bureaucracy. Transparency became ritual, accountability became spectacle, and the rules, carefully written in the name of fairness, ensured that the game could go on, with new players, same stakes, and the same dealer holding all the cards. The paradox of reform is that it requires belief, and belief is the first casualty in Washington. Each election cycle brings vows to dismantle the system, to banish money from politics, to break the cycle of influence. Yet every party that tries discovers the same truth. The machinery of access cannot be destroyed without surrendering the leverage that sustains it. To dismantle lobbying would be to disarm oneself in a world where the other side will not. Reform becomes suicide. Restraint becomes defeat. And so, both sides pretend to fight corruption while quietly preserving its mechanisms. The addiction to control is bipartisan. Every investigation is advertised as a reckoning. But what looks like damage is, in fact, evolution. When one head of corruption is severed, two new ones rise, more discreet, more sophisticated, more defensible. Laws that once criminalized gifts now legalize them as contributions. Consulting firms rebrand as nonprofits. Dark money hides behind light rhetoric. The system doesn't crumble under exposure, it mutates around it. Like a hydra that thrives on the illusion of mortality, each cut only proves its endurance. Reformers claim victory. The machinery calls it maintenance. In time, even conviction begins to corrode. The young reformer becomes the pragmatic legislator. The moralist becomes the strategist. Principles once shouted from the floor now fade into talking points, rehearsed behind closed doors. Cynicism stops feeling like betrayal. It becomes the language of survival. To believe in change is to risk irrelevance. The veterans of this invisible war learn to smile through disillusionment, to call compromise wisdom. In the quiet between sessions, they tell themselves that idealism was a phase, that politics is the art of endurance. But what endures is not belief. It's decay wearing the mask of realism. The narrator's voice falls to a whisper. The hidden war never ended. It simply learned how to survive. Nourished by outrage, sustained by reform, hidden behind the illusion of choice. The same faces rotate through hearings, elections, and boards, playing both victim and victor. What was once corruption is now process. What was once scandal is now precedent. The machine does not rest because it cannot. It breathes through legislation, feeds on polarization, and dreams in the language of democracy. And as long as the public believes the fight continues, the system knows it has already won. The bills still pass. The votes are still counted. The language of democracy endures, but the authors have changed. Legislation once drafted in committee rooms now begins in conference calls with lobbyists. Paragraphs are negotiated line by line, not for public good, but for strategic advantage. The signatures at the bottom belong to elected officials, yet the fingerprints belong elsewhere, to industry lawyers, trade associations, corporate councils. Every reform hides a transaction. Every promise hides a clause. In the post-reform age, the machinery learned to smile, to sell betrayal as governance, to convince the governed that their will was written into laws that no one wrote for them. The result is measurable, undeniable, and devastating. Polls show near unanimous distrust. More than 4 out of 5 Americans believe the system serves the wealthy. It is no longer outrage that defines public opinion, but resignation. Citizens sense what insiders already know, that votes can signal discontent, but not direction. Money sets the course. Influence moves faster than ballots ever could. Apathy, once seen as civic failure, becomes self-defense, a way to preserve dignity when power feels unreachable. The tragedy is not that people stopped believing in democracy. It's that they now believe it cannot hear them at all. The disengagement unfolds quietly, without protest. Election cycles shrink as turnout collapses. Debates devolve into theater, sound bites for algorithms that convert outrage into advertising revenue. Each controversy burns bright, then fades, replaced by another. The system feeds on exhaustion, thriving when citizens grow too tired to care. Anger becomes predictable, monetized, a renewable resource. And as faith decays, cynicism hardens into ritual. People still vote, still argue, still post. But beneath it all lies the same dull certainty. The play will end the same way, no matter how loudly the audience shouts. While faith withers, technology refines the art of control. Artificial intelligence now writes policy drafts in minutes, trained not on ideals, but on historical data from the very lobbyists who shaped the old system. Digital donations flow through crypto networks and shell packs, untraceable and instantaneous. Influence no longer needs a handshake or a back room. It exists as code. Algorithms decide which regulations to challenge, which phrases to echo in campaign ads, which voters to discourage. The future lobbyist is not a person. It's a program, efficient, tireless, and immune to guilt. Corruption, once human, has learned how to automate itself. In the end, only one voice remains. A former whistleblower walks the marble corridors of an emptied government building, where fluorescent lights hum over abandoned offices. They had once believed that truth could awaken conscience, that exposure could break the cycle. Now, they hear the same voices echoing through closed doors, different names, same promises, same trade-offs. The world has moved on, but the deals continue. Silence, they realize, is not imposed. It is chosen by everyone who learned that speaking changes nothing but the speaker's fate. And so the story closes where it began, not in revelation, but reflection. The narrator's voice is calm now, almost tender. We live in a republic of appearances. The parties change, the slogans shift, but the machine endures. It feeds on our outrage, adapts to our reforms, and learns our language faster than we can reclaim it. The war between power and conscience never ended. It simply merged into the rhythm of normal life. Every scandal absorbed, every reform rebranded, every truth repurposed into spectacle. In the mirror of democracy, what stares back is not tyranny, but consent, wearing the mask of choice.